This is the DC Bar's Brief Encounters podcast. I'm Don Resnikoff, representing the DC Bar's antitrust and consumer community. Today's topic is structural reforms to strengthen our financial system. Our speaker is Arthur Wilmarth, Professor Emeritus of Law, George Washington University Law School. He is the author of many articles, far too numerous to list today. His most recent book is called Taming the Megabanks, Why We Need a New Glass-Steagall Act, and that's published by Oxford University Press. And I want to start with a quick word of my own on the complementary relationship between antitrust, which is my field, and bank regulation, which is Art's field. Antitrust puts limits on market power largely through action in the courts. And antitrust has its struggles, particularly these days. And bank regulation can do the same limitation of market power based on structural considerations without the requirement of going to court and finding illegal conduct in particular situations. So I would argue that the relationship between the two fields is complementary. And I could say a great deal more about that, but I will not do that. Instead, what I'm going to do is turn to an excerpt from Art's book, which sort of tees up the nature of the problem that Art will be discussing with us today. The excerpt concerns the disastrous doom loop that occurs when there's government support for speculative activity by so-called universal banks. And the universal banks, as Art will explain in better detail than I can, is a situation where banks don't just do banking, but they extend their reach into securities law and other commercial ventures. And here is the excerpt from Art's book, and I'm quoting. This brings us to the financial crisis of 2007-9. Post-crisis reforms have perpetuated what I call a global doom loop, in which, number one, governments and central banks provide too big to fail guarantees to universal banks. And that is the banks that are involved in risky security tradings and commercial ventures, and also large shadow banks. And governments frequently intervene to maintain the stability of financial markets. Number two, universal banks and large shadow banks finance rapidly rising levels of public sector and private sector debts with support from the easy money policies of central banks. And three, investors and creditors take outside risks because they expect that governments and central banks will take all necessary actions to stabilize financial markets. Art, I'm going to ask you to comment on that. Slightly imperfect reading by me, but I think the point gets across.
Yes, I think that the theme of my book and a lot of my other work has been to say that if we don't separate banking from what I would call capital markets activities and also from commercial ventures, we end up by what I would call bankifying the financial markets and bankifying the economy, because essentially governments have learned, particularly since the Great Depression, and that lesson was reinforced during the global financial crisis of 2007 through 2009, that you cannot allow your banks to collapse. If you allow your banks to collapse, the entire economy collapses with them, because banks, as we can discuss, essentially provide the essential infrastructure and plumbing for economic activity. So if your banks go down, everything goes down with them. Well, if that's the case, then you have to either separate your banks from, as I say, the capital markets and your general commercial economy, or you end up propping up the entire financial markets to save the banks, and then if even possibly the entire commercial economy to save the banks. And then the government is guaranteeing everything. But we know that that's not feasible. And I would argue that if you look at the U.S. government debt, it's essentially quadrupled since 2007, from about 9 to 36 trillion. And a lot of that occurred in response to the global financial crisis and then the pandemic financial crisis of 2020, 2021. And the same phenomenon, the same escalation of public debt has occurred in every other major leading country around the world for similar reasons. And the question has to be, how long can we keep doing this? I think people are finally awakening this past year to the fact that at some point, does the ability of the United States to service this enormous debt load that we've taken on, does our credibility essentially disappear? Do people lose confidence? And that same question is being faced in every major leading economy. So I think that, again, unless we separate banking from the rest of the capital markets and from the general commercial economy, we're headed down a very dangerous path.
Right. And I think that introduction will help our audience understand as we get a little bit more into the weeds. The fact is that these are very, very important issues that really go to whether our economy can survive this doom loop peril that you described. But moving on, Art, I understand that in the past, at least, the U.S. has established structural safeguards for our banking system, and that these are complementary to antitrust enforcement. And I'd ask you to say a few words about those structural protections over time.
Right. So if we go back to, say, the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, there were two generally understood forms of separation. Again, often this was as much a matter of custom as a matter of law, but it was generally understood that banks and the securities markets were separate, and banks were not supposed to be engaged in private securities activities. They were always engaged in buying and selling and underwriting U.S. government debt. That was understood. But they were not supposed to be involved in private securities activities. And that mirrored the tradition of England and the Bank of England. Similarly, it was understood that banks were not supposed to be either owning and controlling or being owned or controlled by commercial ventures. In other words, so that banks were supposed to be independent of commercial ventures and vice versa. Now, again, you can point to situations where these two general principles were ignored or evaded, but if we had unlimited time, I could explain to you why each time people sort of ventured across these lines, separating banks from capital markets and banks from commercial ventures. When they ventured across those lines, bad things happened. And so by 1900, there was this pretty strong understanding that the three areas should be separated. Now, what happened then is that those separations began to break down. And so our first discussion might be what happened, during the roaring 1920s. What happened was that large banks saw that traditional securities firms, what we would call broker-dealers, were making a lot of money underwriting various types of domestic and foreign bonds and domestic and foreign stocks. And the big banks sort of thought, why shouldn't we get in on this game? And the big banks had been very successful in selling U.S. war bonds during World War I, and they thought, hey, we know how to do this. So they set up what were called separately incorporated affiliates, securities affiliates, to carry on this securities business. And by the early 1920s, they were essentially virtually full competitors with broker-dealers in selling all sorts of speculative securities, domestic corporate bonds, domestic corporate stocks, foreign government bonds, so on. And they were making a lot of money doing it. Well, you had a virtual frenzy of securities speculative activity where the banks and the broker-dealers were trying to outcompete each other. And you had this massive boom. I mean, this boom of both credit and equity investment in all sorts of very, you could say speculative enterprises here and abroad.
I think you're going to tell us that didn't work out so well.
No, I mean, obviously in 1929, the whole edifice came crashing down. And it's interesting, for a while, there were a number of people who said, well, the Great Crash didn't have that much to do with the Great Depression. Well, a careful examination certainly rebuts that notion that when the Great Crash occurred, it was a huge, enormous loss of wealth, both here and abroad. And people immediately began cutting back on consumption, cutting back on investment. Many people were driven into bankruptcy. Many firms were driven into bankruptcy. And what happened was that the problems of the collapsed investments and collapsed securities spilled over into the banks. And so you had a number of large banks failing, both in the US and abroad, who were caught up in this activity. And this was somewhat true in the United States, but even more in Europe. There were much stronger ownership links between the large banks and the big commercial enterprises. And so as those commercial enterprises went down during the Great Depression, they dragged the banks with them. So you had this sort of downward spiral where the banks, the securities markets, the commercial ventures were all collapsing. In 1933, as part of the New Deal response to the Great Depression, Congress passed the Glass-Steagall Act. Glass-Steagall Act had a number of important provisions. One was that it created a new system of federal deposit insurance. People had learned that if there wasn't a guarantee for deposits, at least for most depositors, people would take their money out of the bank and stick it into mattresses and the ground and wall safes, and the money supply simply crashed during the Great Depression as people pulled their money out of banks. And they realized to get money back into the banks, we had to have a federal deposit insurance program. Of course, that immediately made people think, well, what are we willing to insure? And pretty quickly, they decided we were not going to insure bank investments or bank involvement in securities activities. And Congress pretty clearly understood that the bank involvement in all these securities ventures and enterprises had turned out very badly. And so the Glass-Steagall Act said, if you were a bank, you may not engage in securities underwriting or investment or dealing with private securities. Again, government bonds, okay, but not private securities. And secondly, if you're a securities firm, you cannot engage in banking.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you to take this point about how Glass-Steagall worked back to our sort of headline point about the doom loop. And how does that separation that you just described for Glass-Steagall deal with this doom loop problem that you started?
Right. So Glass-Steagall basically said, we're now separating traditional banking from capital market securities activities. You cannot be in both. You have to choose. And if you're in banking, you're going to be highly regulated and your deposits are going to be insured, but you're going to be closely supervised. So you then had a very separate banking system from the capital markets. Broker-dealers were not banks and banks couldn't be broker-dealers. That provided a separation of risk, a segmentation of risk, and prevented spillovers from one to the other. So that, for example, when the stock market crash happened in 1987, which was a very severe stock market correction, the banks were not exposed to that because they weren't involved in the securities markets. And in fact, the Fed could call upon the banks to help out the broker-dealers with loans. When you get to the global financial crisis of 2007, in between, as we can discuss, Congress repealed the Glass-Steagall Act. By 2007, now the banks and the broker-dealers are all back together again. And the banks were no longer able to help the broker-dealers as they got into trouble, and the broker-dealers could not help the banks. So then you had this spillover contagion of risks. And the other thing would be, it was understood that if banks went down, if it was sufficiently severe, the Federal Reserve and the FDIC, the federal government was going to get involved in preventing a systemic collapse of the banking system. But there was no such guarantee of the securities markets. So the idea was, if you're putting your money into the securities markets, you cannot expect a government bailout if the securities markets get into trouble. As opposed to if you're in the banking system, yes, you might expect that they're going to prevent large banks from collapsing or a systemic collapse. But there was no such understanding with the securities market. So people realized, hey, I better be more aware of the risks that I'm taking by putting my money into the securities markets.
So to put a fine point on it, the Glass-Steagall separation sort of blocked the doom loop cycle.
Right. It created this firewall, if you like.
That there were some subsequent developments, legislatively and otherwise, which sort of broke down that separation and brought the problem back. So I guess the thing to do would be to ask you to tell us what happened after the Glass-Steagall Act that sort of broke down that separation. And you already mentioned the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act.
Yeah. So beginning, there were some early efforts in the 60s and 70s to sort of create loopholes, break through this Glass-Steagall wall between traditional banking and securities activities, but they didn't go very far. But beginning in the early 1980s, I think very unfortunately, the federal regulators at the Fed and the regulator of national banks, which is called the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, they decided it would be a good idea to do away with Glass-Steagall, but they couldn't get Congress to go along with it because many people in Congress first had memories of the Great Depression still, or maybe they had, through their parents, they understood what had happened, but there was not support in the Congress to repeal the Glass-Steagall Act. So the regulators began creating what I would call novel and even radical interpretations of the Glass-Steagall Act, taking language of the Glass-Steagall Act that was arguably ambiguous and running riot with it and creating all sorts of loopholes to allow banks to get into the securities business and also to allow broker-dealers to get in the banking business. So money market funds came along in the early 1970s. And if you look at the money market fund as they developed with check writing privileges, they were functional equivalents of deposits. But the regulators said, well, these are mutual funds, these are not deposits, so we'll let them happen, even though they knew that these were functional equivalents of deposits that were going to be used to compete with banks. So it was a way for the broker-dealers to get into the banking business, and the banks were getting into the securities business through various kinds of loopholes that the regulators were creating. There's an interesting twist here. This was facilitated by the Chevron doctrine because before 1984, there was no Chevron. And so the early cases back in the 70s and early 80s would say, well, the Glass-Steagall Act means what it says, and so the regulators can't ignore that. But by the time you get past Chevron, they said, well, as long as regulators are acting, for reasonable policy reasons, and you can't prove that Congress said no, the regulators could say yes. And so Chevron had a lot to do with breaking down the Glass-Steagall barriers.
Chevron, we should say for people who don't know, is the doctrine that the
Supreme Court adopted in 1984, right?
The courts should defer to the regulators, and that has been done away with to some extent.
Unless Congress spoke unambiguously against what the regulators said. And that's very hard to prove, that Congress unambiguously said no when the regulators said yes. And there was one famous court decision where the court said, well, this looks like what Santa Ana warned about, which is if you don't remember the past, you're condemned to relive it. But it's not for us to say because Chevron says that we're supposed to defer to the agency here.
Picking up on our narrative here, so you have regulatory erosion, which leads to the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act.
Yes, you get to 1999 and Congress is told, well, there's nothing much left of Glass-Steagall at this point, although there was something left, but not much. Just go ahead and repeal it at this point, which they did in 1999. And then you had this frenzy of, again, involvement of the largest U.S. banks and foreign banks in the capital markets, a number of mergers happening between large banks and large broker-dealers. And then you have the broker-dealers, doing more and more banking activities. And of course, what they focused on in the 2000s was the explosion of these subprime, mortgage-related and commercial loan-related products that were highly speculative, risky loans packaged up into securities with certain kinds of credit ratings, and people were led to believe, oh, these are safe, even though the underlying loans were incredibly risky, which was exactly what was done back in the 1920s, that the banks would package these very risky loans up in securities and say, hey, I'm Citigroup, would I steer you wrong? I'm Bank of America, would I steer you wrong? And people believed that the banks wouldn't be peddling bad stuff, which they did in the 1920s, and they did again in the 2000s. Then you have the global financial crisis came on when all of these underlying mortgages began to default, and then the securities began to default.
So to recap a little bit, so you have the repeal of Glass-Steagall, you have subsequent developments, which you could tell us a little more about, leading to the 2008 financial crisis, which was made worse because of this lack of separation between banking and commerce that you've talked about. And so why don't you recap on that a little bit and then tell us what's happened since 2008 that is concerning from your point of view.
Right. So the banks and the broker-dealers were all in the soup together. So neither could help the other because they were both equally exposed. Now, of course, at this point, the policymakers said, well, we don't want to repeat the Great Depression when we allowed banks to fail. So we cannot allow these large banks to fail. So they essentially said, okay, we're going to bail out the largest banks. We're going to convert the two remaining largest broker-dealers, Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, into banks. We're going to make them banks so we can support them. We're going to bail out AIG, which was another big financial conglomerate. But essentially, we're going to guarantee that every large bank can survive. That was enormously costly. Even with all of that bailout action, you could say, the economy still suffered tremendously. It took us several years to recover from the so-called Great Recession, the global financial crisis. So you have this enormous bailout, severe economic impact, but now the precedent had been established that if you're big enough and you're complex enough, you're going to be bailed out. And when the Dodd-Frank Act was passed, which was sort of the response to the Great Recession, some people said, well, let's bring back Glass-Steagall. I mean, once again, this concept of universal banking, allowing big banks to get into securities activities and do everything, that's been proven to be way too risky, way too speculative, lots of perverse incentives, and we have to bail these guys out. So let's go back to Glass-Steagall and separate them again. But there was no appetite to do that. The Obama administration rejected that approach. So what we ended up with was, well, we'll just regulate them better. We'll make them have more capital, and we'll do other things to regulate them better, which we've tried to do, but in my view, not very successfully.
So to recap on that, Art, the Dodd-Frank Act, in reacting to the 2008 financial crash, rejected the separation approach of Glass-Steagall and instead invoked an intensely regulatory
very
framework.
Technical regulatory response. It would be like saying, well, hey, these nuclear reactors are likely to melt down. Let's just try to improve the technical controls on these reactors rather than saying, hey, maybe they're too dangerous to exist, right? That we shouldn't have them because they're too dangerous.
Right. In our concluding sort of 5 or so minutes that we have, that I think two things you might focus on would be, number one, have there been other legislative initiatives or efforts to deal with the separation problem? And second of all, what would your recommendation be to Congress to make sure that this doom loop problem does not persist and lead to disaster?
Right. Well, I would first say that when the pandemic crisis came along, we did essentially the same thing we did in 2008, 9, and 10, which was to essentially bail everybody out. And in some ways, we spent more money doing that in 2020 and 2021, even than we had done in the last crisis. So the pandemic crisis tells us that the problem persists and is getting worse. Now, certainly Elizabeth Warren and several other senators have periodically introduced proposals for a new Glass-Steagall Act. So that idea has not gone away. It certainly doesn't have a lot of currency right now, but it ought to. I mean, people ought to look seriously at it and say, are we really comfortable with this system that we have? The other thing that's happening is that now you have big tech firms and other commercial enterprises trying to get into the banking business through a variety of mechanisms. The most recent one is, stable coins, which is a form of cryptocurrency that looks a lot like a money market fund. Let's have these various enterprises, which are outside the banking system and not regulated as banks, let's have them offer essentially more deposit substitutes. This is where the notion of shadow banking comes from, that you take a deposit type instrument that's not regulated like a bank deposit, but you can use that to fund a very speculative enterprise. So shadow banking is growing through these deposit substitutes like money market funds and stable coins, and that has to be stopped. Interestingly, one provision of the Glass-Steagall Act, which is still on the books, although not enforced, is the provision that says, if you're not a bank, you may not take deposits, full stop. And in fact, it's a criminal statute. So the Department of Justice has the responsibility of bringing criminal prosecutions, which they've done in a couple little cases, but nothing significant. Interestingly, back in the 1970s, the Department of Justice refused to take any action against money market funds. But this is a big problem because one problem is that the word deposits is not carefully defined. But if we understand deposits to mean a short-term financial claim that is payable at par, which means 100% of face value, either on demand or within a fairly short period of time, I would say 90 days or less. If we define that to be a deposit and said anybody who takes a deposit has to be a regulated bank, then immediately all of these short-term financial claims would be within the regulated banking system. they could be properly monitored and properly regulated. We're not doing that now. So, I mean, my two proposals are to say, one, reinstate Glass-Steagall in terms of separating banks from the securities markets. So we're no longer bankifying and agreeing to bail out the securities markets. And secondly, don't allow anyone that isn't a bank to offer financial instruments to people that are effectively deposits. Because if you do that, you create, some people call it a parallel banking system, some people call it a shadow banking system, but you're creating a parallel system that is essentially arbitraging and undermining the integrity of your banking system. And eventually, as we've seen, we bailed out money markets twice in 2008 and 2020. So if you allow the public to take these things, they will believe that these things will be protected and you'll bail them out. But then you extend the safety net to cover everybody and you undermine the integrity of your regulatory system. So let's have banks be banks. Let's have capital markets be capital markets, and let's keep commercial enterprises out of banking. I think those are my key takeaways.
Right. I think those takeaways have two aspects that I'll ask you about. Number one, I think you are a little bit more than a little pessimistic whether the Congress is going to adopt the idea of this separation of banking from securities and other commerce. So that really is as hazardous to the economy because it leaves the government in a position of sort of bailing out everything at one time rather than banks separately. But one thing that does strike me about this is that in terms of an appeal that goes beyond Congress, that this is an idea that seems fairly straightforward to me in a way that there's a potential of reaching out to the public in general with a campaign that says, let's fix this by separating out the support of the government for failure so that it's just with banks doing banking functions and not the economy as a whole. And so maybe there's a bit of optimism possible.
Yes.
This is a message that people could be convinced of.
I mean, there's certainly some survey evidence showing that there is a very broad popular support for this concept. And the problem, of course, is that there are very entrenched special interests that don't want to see this kind of separation be brought back. But I think that you're right. I think there's broad public support to the extent the public is informed and understands what's at stake. In my view, is we basically have a choice between what I would call, true capitalism, which is that if you're not a regulated bank, you ought to be subject to market forces and market discipline and have the ability to fail, and you shouldn't expect the government to bail you out. Or what I would call crony capitalism, which is that we allow banks to become connected with the capital markets or with commercial enterprises like big tech firms. And then the idea is that everybody gets bailed out. But that essentially is what I would call crony capitalism, that the biggest and most powerful firms in the country are finding ways to force the government to back them up and prop them up by connecting themselves to the banking system. And the last thing I would say is the cheapest form of funding available in today's market is the bank deposit. Look at what you get for your bank deposit, 0.01 or 0.001, whatever it is. Obviously, everybody would love to have that kind of funding source at a very cheap price. My view is that is a privilege that should be restricted only to the regulated banks that are closely supervised, that take care of the public deposits and also make loans to people who can't issue securities in the securities markets. But that is not a funding device that should be made available across the board to every big company that can somehow get themselves connected to a bank.
I got you. So let's hope that many, many people will watch this podcast and get your message.
Call your senator, call your member of Congress, right? And say, we want Glass-Steagall to come back, right? And keep big tech out of banking.
Okay, so this will bring us to an end. And thank you very much, Art, for bringing your message to a broader audience.
Thank you, Don. I appreciate it.